Thank you, Julia, for the introduction, and thank you all for showing up tonight. What I would like to do this evening is basically give you the broader context in which the current BC referendum on electoral reform stands. Why do we actually want to reform our electoral systems? And what do we hope to achieve by it? What is the background? What are the negative examples we've seen in perhaps other countries, perhaps in BC itself? Just to reiterate, I'm really very happy to actually give this talk tonight, because today is the first day of voting in BC. So this is a really good opportunity to take up this topic and to try to communicate some of the broader ideas political scientists have developed about electoral reform. I'm also particularly happy that you all showed up tonight because there is competition. I announced it first and my department put up this one here with Ken Carty, Ken Carty, Emeritus Professor and former Brenda and David McLean Chair in Canadian Studies, as well as with Richard Jobsen, who is also affiliated with Green College, Canada Research Chair in Electoral Studies. So, well, thank you so much for choosing me over them. On the other hand, I guess it's on the other hand, I think it's always helpful to hold these talks when the really knowledgeable people are engaged elsewhere. All right, let's have a look at what we are going to do tonight. Well, first of all, I want to give you a brief primer on electoral systems. This is basically me introducing the political science jargon to you. What are the kinds of words we use and what do they actually mean? Then I will have a brief look at the electoral referenda we have in BC, and finally discuss the question, why would we actually want to change our electoral systems, and give you some pros and cons for the various options we have. All right, let's start with the political science jargon. A primer on electoral systems. Well, first of all, you could ask, what is actually an electoral system? Well, an electoral system is basically a set of rules that help us determine, to choose the people which rule our country temporarily. Basically, the way it works is this. We have some kind of an election outcome due to voting. And then the electoral system tells us how this voting outcome is translated into seats in parliament. And basically, this is just you could say it's like a dictionary, more or less, like a translation exercise of the popular will into representation in the parliament. Well, now electoral referenda are an important process because we are changing the rules we use to select the people who are actually making the rules in the broader political system. So they are extremely important events. Now, I got a question when I talked about my talk tonight a couple of weeks ago, and one person actually asked me, why do we need these weird electoral systems? And well, my response was more or less it's economies of scale. Unless you have very, very small social communities where you can decide everything through discussion, you need some kind of a more abstract system to still have a democracy when you have a country such as Canada with 36 million inhabitants. Well, now you may ask, what do we expect from an electoral system? Well, an electoral system should somehow accurately represent an electoral outcome in parliament. Now, the emphasis here is on accurately. You don't want a party which only gained 20% of the popular vote to get 60% of the seats. The second point is to give the elected representatives legitimacy. You have established procedures and you basically agree upon certain rules according to which certain people are allowed to govern for a couple of years. Now, another requirement we want of electoral systems is ideally it should be quite simple so that actually people can understand them. This is basically the idea. Electoral systems in a democracy themselves should be democratic in the sense that they can be widely understood and followed. A fourth characteristic is we somehow want to build a government through an electoral system, through the outcomes it produces. And therefore we need a clear winning majority of either a party or a coalition of parties. Fifth, we want to have ideally some kind of an electoral system that does not favor extreme anti-democratic parties, but rather furthers more moderate parties. We want, in some cases, to represent minorities through our electoral system. If we think they are important, we want them to be in parliament. And finally, we want to reduce something that is called wasted votes. Well, this is one very nice political science jargon. Basically, a wasted vote is a vote that does not contribute to the election of a candidate. How could that happen? Well, a good example is the United Kingdom. These are here the 2015 general election results. And so, for instance, if you look here at the area around Liverpool and Manchester, if in Liverpool you're a conservative, you might as well not show up for the election because your vote will not make a difference. Because in Manchester, the electoral districts are generally favorable towards Labour. And if you go and vote as a conservative supporter, it will not matter. In that sense, it's a wasted vote, and you might actually not show up. In the 1980s, this phenomenon has become so dominant in the UK system that actually only 15% of electoral districts were actually really competitively contested. The rest were so-called safe seats. And the other 15% were the marginal constituencies. In other words, UK elections in the 1980s were won in 15% of the electoral districts, just because the other electoral districts were so safe, either for Labour or for the Conservatives. That has slightly changed, but as a tendency, it's still true today. And basically, one demand we can have of an electoral system is to reduce this phenomenon. Now, this is the moment where I have the first bad piece of news for you. We can't have it all. We've got to make some choices. There is no perfect electoral system that will maximize all of these 7 criteria. And some of you may, for instance, completely disagree with one of these 7 criteria because you have different priorities in what you expect an electoral system to achieve. So, and therefore, it's always interesting because you have to make choices, actually. And this is partly what electoral referenda are about. Well, another term, electoral districts. Well, an electoral district is some kind of a territorial subdivision you have in your polity in which candidates for parliament are run. Sometimes these are also called constituencies, such as in the US, or ridings in Canada. These districts exist in single or multiple member form, which means sometimes it can be in some countries that you elect several members of parliament from a single district. They don't have to be single member districts. Normally the idea behind these electoral districts is that they should roughly represent the same amount of population. Electoral District A should be a representation of about the same amount of population as Electoral District B. Now, of course, people are so mean and start moving around over time, which means that you have to redraw your electoral district boundaries at times, which can be a very controversial process, as you see in the US, because if you draw them in a certain way, it might favor one party over another. Okay, another question I got. Why do we need these electoral districts? What are they for? Well, basically you could say they are a form of local representation. Since we have these abstract electoral systems, we still want to have an element of local representation of somebody in parliament standing up for you all. And this adds the idea as a personal connection to politics. In US-American fashion, we could call this campaigning barbecue style, because that is literally what some US politicians do. They invite their constituencies to barbecues, and then that is campaigning. But it's some form of a local connection you develop towards your representative. Now actually the interesting part comes. Electoral systems come in different flavors. And the first flavor is the so-called first past the post system, frequently abbreviated as FPTP. Well, it is a district-based system. So for instance, here you see the districts for Vancouver, colored for NDP or Liberals in this case. And the idea basically is whoever in a specific district gets the most votes wins the seat for that district. Relatively simple. And typical examples of these are the UK, Canada, and India. Don't be confused, these systems are sometimes also called majoritarian or Westminster systems because they come from the UK and they were the first one to develop this.
Where does the term first past the post originate?
I don't know where exactly it comes from, but basically the idea is who basically comes in first, i.e. with the highest votes, gets the seat. That's the intuition.
But there's no post, there's no fixed finish line.
No, it's just like the idea is the one who gets furthest. Yeah. So for instance, here you see the results for the point gray area, which is where we are. And you just see that the candidate with the most votes, in this case 55% of the overall vote, won this district. Of course, it is not always quite as clear. So for instance, here are the results for Richmond-Queensborough, where in percentage terms you had a difference of 2% between the first candidate and the second candidate. In this case, only this candidate got the seat. And therefore you could really say that first past the post is a very competitive system. As the saying goes, the winner takes it all, the loser standing small. Which, of course, is a favorite line from ABBA. All right, this is the first system. Another multi-member form of the first past the post is the United States. Basically, the equivalent here is that specific US states are one electoral district, and they have so-called electoral colleges. And so, for instance, you could say California returns 55 members. So this is one example of a multi-member first past the post system, roughly speaking. So what are the advantages this first past the post system comes with? Well, the idea is that it offers you a very clear choice between two political alternatives, two sets of public policies. For historically very complex reasons, first past the post systems tend to converge towards two-party systems, just because you get these enormous advantages towards winning electoral districts, and that favors two-party competition. Basically, the idea is that this system should have a moderating influence on our voters indirectly through the parties. The idea is basically that you have two parties, such as the Labours and the Conservatives, and basically the Labours don't gain very much by making very left-wing politics, because then they lose the voters in the middle. So basically these voters here in the middle of the preference distributions of the parties, that are the voters that will decide the election. And therefore these are the voters the two parties will compete for, which of course, since this is the center of the political distribution, this should moderate the parties. So it's one key argument for first past the post, that they actually don't give extreme parties a lot of chances. One very contested argument in favor is that also these party systems tend to produce relatively clear majorities just because they have a tendency to throw out all small parties, so that it basically converges towards a two-party competition system. If you don't believe this simple voter logic, actually there is like a campaign to vote no in the current referendum, which makes precisely this argument. Our current way of voting has provided our province with reliable, steady governance for more than 100 years. Let's keep your electoral process simple, stable, and successful by voting no to proportional representation. So people are actually making these arguments in the current referendum. Well, let's turn to the second type of electoral system, which is proportional representation. Normally this system is so-called list-based. So the idea is we have some kind of a party, party A, and the party now says which is the order in which their candidates will enter the parliament. So the idea is party A before the election makes up this list, then we have an actual election, and we compete for a parliament of 100 seats. Party A now wins 30% of the vote, then it will also get 30 seats in the parliament, because conveniently I've expressed it out of 100. And so, and so just the first 30 people on this list will make it into parliament. So a pure proportional representation system actually doesn't need any electoral districts. And now basically every party will roughly get the share of seats in parliament that corresponds to the popular vote. I put the roughly in there for the people who are extremely clever and say, well, you can't have 31.67 members in parliament. Of course, you have to do some rounding. Therefore, it's never 100% perfect, but you get very, very close to it. Now, this is the most basic version of a proportional representation system. It actually does exist in reality. Some examples are Portugal, the Netherlands, South Africa. But there are many, many more complex models. So actually you could say of the two very basic distinctions you can make between party systems, this is the messy one because in reality it comes with very, very different forms. Some of these forms we will encounter later when we look at the concrete proposals they've made for us here in BC. So what are some of the advantages of the PR system? Well, you get a very close reflection of the popular vote. That's what actually the people voted for. You reduce the wasted votes because every vote literally counts. And finally, you also get a representation of minorities just because you don't kick out small parties. If you have a party that gains 6% of the overall vote, they will also get roughly 6% in the parliament. One final distinction some people of you may have been wondering about, sometimes there are two chambers to parliaments. As a tendency, the so-called lower house or lower chamber is the more important one. So for instance, in Germany, the lower chamber is our main parliament where a lot of the laws are made, and the upper chamber or upper house is a federal representation of the states, which actually is not directly elected but changes according to state level elections. So whenever, for instance, there's an election in Bavaria, the composition of this will change. Whereas in the US, the Senate plays a relatively important role. Another example of an upper house which is not particularly powerful is in the UK. The UK upper house basically doesn't have any say. They can delay some things at times, but they don't have any control over the legislative process. So when I'm talking about parliament or elections nowadays, I mostly mean this lower house here, because the upper houses in many countries are elected in very idiosyncratic ways, such as in Germany, where they actually aren't directly elected. All right, let's turn to the locals. BC and the upcoming referendum. Let me just give you a brief introduction that actually electoral referenda are very, very rare. They don't happen very, very often. Although we've seen a couple of referenda in recent years, and just as a general direction of change, all the change we have seen, or all the proposals we've seen, has been away from first past the post towards some form of proportional representation. We haven't seen any proposals in the opposite direction, actually. And indeed, if you look at all democracies combined, the vast majority of them are already using proportional representation systems. It's only a few that still have first past the post systems, such as the US, Canada, the UK as the most important ones. Yes, some significant cases of electoral system change in the last 3 decades have, for instance, been New Zealand. Does anybody know any other changes in electoral systems? And when I'm talking about change here, I don't mean nudging a little bit the threshold at which parties enter, which they tend to do in Israel, but really a systematic change from first past the post to proportional representation. Does anybody know any other examples of that? The second one is Australia. So this is also why this label, Westminster democracies for first past the post systems, has become under attack because 2 rather important examples of them aren't first past the post anymore. New Zealand has adopted some form of the mixed member proportional, which is also on the table here for BC, whereas Australia has some form of the single transferable vote. I will still later get into these systems. Another case, actually, which would have led to the extermination of the Westminster model was the 2011 referendum in the UK for the alternative vote, but it actually failed. It was one of the 3 big referenda which David Cameron described as putting important questions to the people. All right, electoral referenda in BC. Let's look at the history. Actually, here in BC, you are very fortunate because BC is possibly the only place on earth that actually has, in any meaningful sense, a history of electoral referenda, because you are now at the 3rd referendum in 2018. The first one was in 2005, and back then the choice was between first past the post and the so-called single transferable vote, which is a relatively complex system. I will later still roughly tell you how it works. So that was on the table in 2005. So in 2009, the government said, well, let's try it again, following the maxim that it is harder to say no twice rather than just once. And so you basically had the same referendum again. And now in 2018, we have another referendum. Looking at the 2005 referendum, basically back then, as some of you may be aware, actually BC had a very interesting approach in which a citizen assembly that would meet during 2004 several times in the Vancouver area would decide which alternative would be proposed to the people in a referendum as compared to the first past the post system. The referendum was scheduled for the same day as provincial elections, and the passing rules were you had to get at least 60% of the overall vote, and you had to get a simple majority in favor in at least 60% of the electoral districts. Actually, only 2 electoral districts voted no. You had the majority in all others. Unfortunately, you failed the first criterion, which was you need to get 60%. This referendum was at 57.7%. Why these high thresholds? Well, basically the idea is electoral systems matter, and therefore when you change them, it should be difficult to change them. You need very strong majorities to do so. Just to say, 4 years ago I took an undergraduate course on democratic governance, and one of the goals was that we would look at some of the most exciting democratic innovations around the world, and 1 week was on the Citizen Assembly here in British Columbia. And that course was taught back home in Germany. So actually people were paying attention to what was going on here in BC. So now, of course, the question you might ask is, why did you actually have this referendum? It was a response to rather anomalous electoral outcomes in 1996, when actually the NDP lost 3% compared to the previous elections of the popular vote, gained 39.5% of the vote, whereas the Liberals almost got 42%, but the NDP, due to the electoral features, actually got the electoral majority. So in 2001, the Liberals decided they would campaign on electoral system change. Actually, they won the election by exterminating the opposition. They won 77 out of 79 seats in the system they wanted to abolish, which is kind of a contradiction, but they still put it to a referendum. So, which leads us to the 2009 referendum, because the party thought, oh well, last time we were very, very close, and actually there was one element of strong uncertainty, which is the government had not decided what would happen to electoral districts, how they would be resized as a change of the electoral system. So they thought we're going to do the entire process again, but this time tell people how their electoral districts actually would change. Well, this referendum wasn't linked to a general election, so you had a lower turnout, and also most probably people were tired of voting on the same thing again, and so basically a huge majority voted against this. For the electoral, for keeping the first past the post almost 61%. So now the question is, why are we having a referendum again in 2018? Well, basically it has to do with a coalition agreement between the NDP and the Greens, who said we now finally want to change the system because they had just come into power last year due to a minority government arrangement with the NDP, where the Greens supported the NDP. So, in this electoral referendum, you have even more choice than in previous ones, because the referendum is between first past the post, of course again, and various forms of proportional representation. Actually, 3 are on the menu for you. So, the current referendum happens through mailing. You don't have to go anywhere, and I guess most of the local residents here should have received it already. So you're allowed to vote if you're a Canadian citizen, at least 18 years old, and resident of BC for at least 6 months by November 30th, which will be the end of the voting period. Until then, your votes have to be in. So people who are still registered in Ontario, have been living here for a couple of years, unfortunately can't vote, because they aren't registered residents in BC. All right, let's look at what's on the table. Well, basically what you receive in the mail should roughly look like this. I can't double check because I'm not allowed to vote here. The rules for passing are basically more than 50% of people voting have to say I'm for first past the post or for proportional representation. If more than 50% are first past the post, it will stay the old way. If at least 50% are for proportional representation, there will be a change. And as we will discuss later, you have several options on the menu. If a majority says we want a change, then just the proportional representation option, which gets the most support, will be the one that will actually get implemented. So let's look at question 1, which is really very basic. It just asks you, do you want the current first past the post voting system, or do you want a proportional representation voting system? Simple choice. The second one is slightly more complicated, because first of all, you have the option between 3 different proportional regimes, and then you have to rank them in your order of preferences. You have to say which one do you like most, which one do you like second most or third most. You actually can also only say I like, for instance, dual member proportional, and that's the only one I want. Then you just say that's my first option and leave the other blanks. It's important to say that these 2 questions are independent. So you could just answer the first one and say I want proportional representation. I don't know which one, so I'll just leave it blank. Your vote will still count here. You could also say, I don't want proportional representation, I vote for first past the post, but you could still say which one of these you want if they came. So they are independent. That is important to know. If you can't make up your mind between these here, you still can make your opinion count through question 1. All right. So, question to you. Is anybody willing to give a brief summary of these 3? I'm happy nobody is getting a hand up, because otherwise I would have asked you to take the presentation over. Because even as a political science student, when I read about this referendum first, I only knew one of the 3 options. So it's a rather complicated menu. So let's look at them in some medium level detail. So the first one is mixed member proportional. Mixed member proportional has been a relatively popular system during recent years. Whenever people talked about electoral referenda and changing electoral systems, this has been one of their favorite options. Basically, you could say it's halfway fashionable, it's been tested in a couple of countries, it's halfway popular. So the basic idea here is that you try to have the best of 2 systems. You actually get 2 votes. One is the so-called party vote, where you vote for like NDP, Greens, Liberals, or what have you. The other vote is for a concrete candidate running in your electoral district. Now, important, these 2 votes are independent. You could vote Green here, you could vote Liberal here, or any other combinations. They aren't linked to each other. Now, this here, the party vote, you could say is the proportional representation component, whereas this here is the first past the post component. Now, does anybody know which country came up with this crazy system? Yes, I heard it. It's yes, indeed, it was Germany's invention after World War II. So basically, but it's not only used in Germany, but also in other countries, and in some subnational units such as Wales and Scotland use it, even though overall UK is first past the post. This system, as proposed in BC, they directly copied this from Germany. It has a 5% threshold for parties to enter parliament. So which means that any party which doesn't make 5% on this party vote here will not get into the parliament. If they have 4.5%, they will just be kicked out and not get in. So let's look at how it works. This is the recent German parliament from October 2017. You see here are 6 parties in there. This is the German parliament from 1933, the last democratic parliament we had before World War II. And here you basically can see why you have this 5% threshold. The idea is to reduce the overall number of parties, which here were about a dozen, which now we have 6. And the idea is that this makes it easier to find coalitions if the vote is not as widely spread. It is easier to agree on things, because one of the big problems in the Weimar Republic was that you never got any stable majorities, and therefore the argument became rather popular. Oh, this system is not producing anything stable, let's just get rid of it. That was the motivation why Germany did it, and actually a lot of countries thought that was a relatively reasonable thought. Yes?
You must forgive me for that. There used to be a mathematician who likes counterexamples.
Yes.
What do you do if no party gets more than 5% of the vote?
That has never happened, and so nobody thought it would be a problem. So normally it only normally always gets 3, 4, 5 big parties in there, so it has never been an empirical problem, and it is unlikely to ever be one. Yes?
So you're voting for a party and you're voting for a candidate, and it could be different.
Mm-hmm.
So what if the party gets less than 5%?
Yes, that's...
The candidate gets?
Oh, then, yes. then the candidate still gets in but will be without a party. Yes.
And also, the 5%, has that kept tiny fringe parties out pretty strategically? Those that just are really off the wall?
It has kept out any party that has less than 5%, yes. Oh, I mean, you can do a lot of hair splitting. Is it 5? Is it 3.25, which you have in Israel right now, or at least had a couple of years ago? You can talk a lot about what is reasonable, but at some point you have to decide on a number. And so Germany was the first one to have this system, and so a lot of people just copied over the 5%. Yeah, but there's no specific reason why it should be 5% as compared to 6.5%. Yeah. So these are the results from the last German election. Now, of course, you have the problem that these two votes here may not perfectly align. In the last German election, Merkel's party CDU-CSU won 62% of the direct electoral mandates, but got only 33% of the popular vote. Now, we are in a proportional representation system. This party should only have 33% of the seats. So, a problem. What do you do? Well, the solution has been to just inflate the size of the parliament. Well, the idea is, in this case, Merkel's CDU got 185 direct seats, all the black ones here, but only gained 15 additional seats through the PR component. And they basically, you inflated the PR component of all other parties so that the seats that the CDU-CSU in the end had would reflect 33% of the overall seat distribution in parliaments. Well, you say that is a rather unpredictable system, yes, and it has become more unpredictable over time because the size of the German parliament has increased. Right now, Germany has the great distinction of being the largest democratically elected parliament on earth. We are better than the Brits now. Actually, only if you look at general assemblies, only the Chinese Congress is bigger, but it's of course not democratically elected in most people's minds. Good. So this brings us to the second system, the rural-urban proportional. Now, this is a weird hybrid of what we've just seen from Germany, the mixed member proportional, and a single transferable vote, that which the citizen assembly here in DC decided upon. So the idea is basically that in the single transferable vote, you will rank your candidates according to your preference. That candidate is my number 1, that candidate is my number 2. You don't have to rank all of them, you can just rank 1 or 4, as in this example. It doesn't matter. Now the idea is, of this system, in order to get rid of this goddamn inflation of parliament, people have found out that if we run the single transferable vote in urban districts and mixed member proportional in more rural seats, then this inflation process will not be quite as big. Well, the reason for this, it has a lot to do with the higher population density in cities, and that actually these districts in cities would allow you to run several candidates from several different parties. Because here, in this case, it can be, for instance, Party C can run several candidates. Normally, in rural areas, your districts would have been so enormously large to allow this that it's not really viable and you couldn't have local representation because members of parliament literally would have to cover a very huge area. Now, does anybody know where this was pioneered? Germany, yes! More precisely, not only German, but even Bavarian. Basically, the people in Bavaria came up with this idea of having a slightly different electoral system for rural seats, and then the Canadian Institute for Fair Voting said, okay, let's institutionalize this and develop it further so you can actually implement it for Canada, which has this problem of having a lot of concentration of people in cities, whereas you have relatively large rural districts. So this is more or less tailor-made for Canada. Now we come to a third system, which basically has the idea that you don't have single-member districts, but two-member districts. The first member you elect to parliament will be according to first past the post. Just simple majority is enough. But then there is a second candidate. And this second seat per district would allow you to reach proportionality, just because you give the second seat in such a way that you will reach proportionality of seats in the parliament. This is a relatively complex mathematical procedure. There are actually quite a lot of formula behind it. The idea is that, for instance, if the Green Party needs one additional seat, it will get that seat from an electoral district where it has been the second strongest party, when, for instance, the first seat got to the Liberal Party. Does anybody know where this was pioneered? Yes. Actually, it wasn't, well, it was more invented by a mathematics graduate student at the University of Alberta who thought this would be a good option for Canada. So if you want to be very innovative, entrepreneurial, try something new, this will be your option. All right, now let me say these systems may have very, very different stipulations and what have you, but in the end they are all more or less proportional representation systems. So let's now look at some of the advantages or disadvantages that come with such changes. Just to remind you, these are the 7 criteria you could use to evaluate electoral systems. If we look at first past the post, what is first past the post good at? Well, first past the post gives your local representatives a direct mandate, and therefore they are very, very legitimate. One of the charges brought against proportional representation is, it's basically the parties deciding who gets in. If party A puts someone on number 3 in the overall ranking, that person will normally get in. If you have a party that gets like 30 or 40% of the vote, what has that person actually done to get in if they've just been networking inside the party? That's one of the key arguments. Well, it's a relatively simple electoral system. Just whoever gets the most vote in a district will win overall. And it's also, on average, relatively good in producing clear winning majorities. If it does not, you have a problem because people aren't used to forming coalitions and in many cases go into minority governments. What it is not so good at is, it also favors a pro-democratic centrist party. Just because, as we said, all extreme parties are kicked out because they normally don't get so many votes. What it's not so good at is accurately transferring popular preferences into votes to represent minorities because they are in many cases just kicked out of the parliament, to reduce wasted votes. And I want to show you some of the examples. One problem with first past the post is basically that errors in vote counting are extremely consequential. Because if you're just wrong by 5 votes, and those 5 votes make the difference between candidate A and candidate B, you're going to have a problem. And actually in the 2017 election, 3 districts here in BC had to be recounted because they were so close and they were uncertain which candidate actually won. Another very famous example is the Bush-Gore standoff, where basically relatively dubious decisions concerning Florida may actually have decided which candidate became the president. Another problem is that you get significant discrepancies between the popular vote and the distribution of seats in parliament. Basically, first past the post is not so much about how big the majority is with which you win, but how well this majority is distributed across space. So for instance, if we look at the 2012 presidential election in the US and compare it to the 2016 election, actually Mitt Romney was better on the popular vote than Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton in this case lost the election, although she got a much higher share, or well, moderately higher share of the popular vote. Basically what happened is in my opinion, Democrats in already democratic states were so scared of Trump that these states became even more democratic. But if you win California with 51% of the vote compared to 55% of the vote, you still get 55 electoral colleges. So it doesn't make any difference. Whereas Trump was very good at winning a lot of states relatively marginally, but relatively widely spread. It discriminates against smaller parties. A typical case are the Green parties. Example from BC. This is the seat distribution. The Greens got 3 seats or 4% in the parliament, although they got 16.7% of the overall vote. So they are underrepresented. Big exception to this is unless these small parties are geographically concentrated. Example, UK. With the Scottish Nationals, which actually, because they are, well, obviously concentrated in Scotland, they only gained 4.7% of the overall vote, but because they won all of these seats up here, they gained 8.6% of the seats in Parliament. Basically, they got a lot of votes up here and none here. So basically, therefore, first past the post has problems with regionally concentrated parties because they defy somehow this logic of holding down parties because they actually can win electoral districts in concentrated areas. One relatively abstract critique is that first past the post system are associated with an adversarial form of politics. This comes from the Dutch political scientist Aaron Leipart. He says that proportional representation, because you need to make coalitions, you need to negotiate, produces like a culture of consensus and compensation and what have you. And therefore he argued that proportional representation is associated with a kinder and gentler form of democracy than first past the post. And well, basically these are his criteria for the consensus model, which is, according to him, this power sharing model. MPR is one of the components you have in there. Also, some people say that first past the post systems are inherently a male type of approach. It's about being adversarial, it's about being competitive, it's not about making kind of compensation agreements and what have you, and therefore the US American political science professor Jane Mansbridge actually argued that if you want to take feminism into politics, you should promote PR systems. All right, I will finish up in about 5 minutes just by telling you a little bit more about evaluating proportional representation. What is it good at? Well, first of all, it's very good at accurately representing overall vote distributions. That is what it has been designed for, more or less. It's good at representing minorities. It's very good at reducing wasted votes. It's not so good at giving elected representative legitimacy. This varies slightly across different proportional representation systems, but the basic idea is that some people may just get into parliament because they did well in their party and are therefore high on the list. They aren't particularly simple electoral systems because the pure form of PR hardly ever exists. And as you see in BC, some of these systems are very, very difficult to understand. Actually, I had problems understanding the one in the mathematical sense by the maths graduate student from the University of Alberta. Even I couldn't understand all of his equations. They can have problems in producing a clear winning party. So in order for proportional representation systems to work, you actually need to combine them with some kind of a culture of compromise. And you can get very small extreme parties in there just because if they are above the threshold, they will get in. It's a question whether that matters, but some people care about it a lot. Actually, this vote no in BC, they made all the good arguments against PR systems. I really thought they had done some good research. So they argue, oh, they tend to be more complex, and then you see like this formula here. Yes, they are right. That's one key argument if you want electoral systems actually to be understandable by people. PR makes it easier for extreme parties to gain representation, the perfect platform for extremist parties. It's true on average, yes, still PR will not create like an extremist party immediately. So if you vote PR in British Columbia, it will not immediately become Nazi Germany. So you should be careful with this. But as a tendency, it's correct. We had this, members of parliament are chosen within parties. So for somebody who has just been very influential in the party and was put on number 3, may just easily get into parliament just because they had a very favorable position within the party and not because they were very good at attracting popular support. So some potential consequences if we actually change BC's electoral system. Well, one might be if you change to proportional representation, the parties would have to change. They would have to implement this form of internal party lists, which means some kind of a substantial change for them within. You will also have to rezone some electoral districts depending upon which proportional form of representation you take. Some, for example, the very complex one from the student from the University of Alberta, you would somehow have to move to 2 member districts, which can be difficult. There are already plans in place, but still it may pose some problems. PR systems generally have been associated, and there's quite a good research on this, by producing a higher voter turnout, just because you don't have these wasted votes. The Conservatives in Manchester will still go voting. You tend to have more women in parliament in these systems. And you tend to have more expansive welfare programs. Now there is here a substantial problem of causal attribution. We just haven't seen enough changes of electoral systems to say whether these outcomes come from the electoral systems or these outcomes and the electoral systems come from a more basic cultural orientation of the states that have them. So this doesn't necessarily have to happen. We actually still need more cases. Exactly. Good. Let's jump this one. It's not so important. And let's just go to the conclusion. Basically, I want to end with 3 cautions. First of all, you can actually have too many referenda. To be honest, it's, right now it's like, oh, we didn't get the result we wanted. Let's have another referendum and another referendum. This is the position some conservatives take in the UK concerning the Brexit right now. But if you really have a lot of referenda, it does seem like, oh, let's make the people vote until we have the result we actually want. So this is one of the potential dangers. Well, as I said, we don't have any systematic evidence to really evaluate these system changes. And therefore, we don't know exactly what kinds of outcomes they will produce. And finally, we have to be very, very careful. Actually, electoral rules aren't all determining. There are also important underlying cultural differences. And something such as electoral engineering really doesn't exist. Actually, I think there have been several examples of political science colleagues of mine, particularly in the 1990s, who went into developing countries and thought, oh, all of this conflict, if we only get the right electoral system in place and we have the right consensus among the parties, all the problems will solve themselves. So just to say, electoral rules are important, but they aren't all determining. Also, like the way parties work out, how the systems work, are very important. Thank you.